Years ago, filmmaker and director Elena Engel began collaborating with actor and producer John Leguizamo on a film project that would become John Leguizamo Live at Rikers. The film documents John Leguizamo's one-man performance of his play Ghetto Clown for inmates at Rikers Island Correctional Facility. In the play, John discusses the adversity he faced growing up. The film simultaneously weaves together conversations between John and justice-involved young men at Rikers. Together, they discuss the serious challenges of incarceration, their stories, and their hopes for the future as they await trial or sentencing. Elena and John initially met at an event for the organization Getting Out and Staying Out that the participants in the film are enrolled in.
We wanted to highlight anti-recidivist programs. That's what John and I wanted from the very beginning. What I could hope for is that people will look at this and will understand that there is hope for justice-involved young people to move on, to adapt a new approach to life, a new paradigm, so that we don't have to see this recycling.
Elena and I discussed the process of making the film at Rikers, collaborating with John Leguizamo on the film, the need for change in the criminal justice system, and creating an impactful film while highlighting the importance of reentry programs such as Getting Out and Staying Out. That's coming up in a moment. From the New York City Center for Media Education, this is CME Presents, where we explore how the digital stories and media that we watch, listen to, and experience are created. I'm Jacob, and this is a conversation with Elena Engel.
Hi,
Hey,
how are you?
I'm good. Nice to finally meet you.
Nice to meet
visually,
you
I guess.
too.
Elena, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to discuss the process of your film, John Leguizamo, Live at Rikers. Before we jump into that, you've had a very prolific career, I think it's safe to say. And I'm wondering, you've produced a lot of different formats of media. What was the process of moving into filmmaking and producing films such as this one?
I started off in audio, in radio. I was working for National Public Radio and creating an original children's radio show called Kid Wax for a station in Eugene, Oregon, back in the day. And we became one of the first nationally syndicated radio shows on NPR. That's dating me a little bit, but I have to do that these days because that's the reality of our life. So I started off there, and from there I got a letter of interest from Walt Disney saying, we would really like to talk to you about becoming a producer at the studio, what they called back then book and tape, which were read-alongs for children. Suffice to say, I was hired to be the producer, and I moved down to LA from where I lived up in Oregon, and I ended up producing maybe 10 book and tapes, a lot of them classic feature film stories, one of which was Fox and the Hound, and I was nominated for a Grammy. From there, the division that was called the non-theatrical division hired me to come over, and I knew nothing about filmmaking. I had never taken a filmmaking class. I had studied theater and acting. I ended up going over there, and they said, okay, you're going to be making film for children.
Was the goal ever in your life to make films? Was that even on the radar in terms of moving in that space?
No, absolutely not. That's a very good question. I was always interested in children's media. So it all began for me. I had a degree, a background in developmental psychology, majored in that, and I got my master's in creative dramatics, thinking that I was going to be doing therapy with children using theater. And I produced a radio piece, and one thing led to another, and that's how I got into sound. And then when I got to the radio station, I was producing this program for them, and I ended up, like a lot of NPR stations, there was not a lot of money, and they wanted to keep me on as a producer. So I applied for a woman's grant, technical grant from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, and I was one of 10 women around the country that received a grant to learn engineering. So there I was in the studio in a different way. And I'm very grateful for that because it gave me, I think, much more of a compass and perspective on what it took to create sound. So, one thing sort of, everything just kind of like, progressed. One door opened and I went in, and another door opened and I went in. And when I went over to film at Disney, what I did have under my belt and like to talk about a lot is a love of story and just an instinctual and kind of and honed. And I think editing sound material was an extremely good thing for me to have been doing because it really taught me a lot about rhythm, timing, editing, editing story. That was my cushion when I went over. And I was in a position of being sort of a, executive producer and a development person. So I was able to hire really good people in Los Angeles to line produce my films. And from there, we just started winning awards right and left. And I was on the first team at Disney to start the Disney Channel. So I was on the first creative team. That was very cool. That was really fun.
It seems like a very big jump from the audio space to creating films. Was there apprehension there, or right away you felt like you had found your footing?
Having been a director and having developed projects and working in preparation to make films, working with very good people. I always used to say that my definition of a good producer is somebody who hires the right people and gets the hell out of their way. And, I had very good people. I had some really excellent people that had already made feature films, went on to make feature films. So I learned from everybody that I hired and I worked with. Being at Disney, you really were expected, no matter how much time you spent on the set, you're expected to be back at the water cooler Monday morning at 8:30 a.m. Because you're working for a corporation. And so I've always said to younger people in my life, who are going after this business, it's like, if you get a chance to work for a company, a corporation, I think that there are advantages to that. You learn a lot about the politics, you learn a lot about negotiation. You learn what you can and cannot do with your skills and with other people's skills. So despite the fact that I was paid nothing, I was very grateful to Walt Disney for being a breeding ground, for my career.
It's about the life lessons, I guess, not the money in that context.
It was definitely, you're young enough to just say, I am thrilled and honored to have this experience, to be around the people that I'm getting like phenomenal creative exposure to. And I'm also getting a broader, more global perspective on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I mean, I produced films that are, I have to tell you, so many years later, still being sold at Disney, even though the educational division, the non-theatrical division, is no longer in existence. Because what I saw going into the work was a need for kind of a niche for social issue films. So we started to have a lot of support for making inroads in material that mattered. And that, I think that kind of, established my interest as well in trying to make films that matter.
In many ways, it seems like, from my outside perspective, that was kind of paving the way towards this film that we're talking about today, John Leguizamo Live at Rikers, in terms of, this is obviously a social issue piece. And, as you discussed, you spent many years making work. Why was now the time to create this piece with John Leguizamo?
Well, it wasn't now. Except the post-production was now. Post-production took place the last year and a half in preparation for launching the film. We actually shot the film 10 years ago.
Did you really?
Yes, we did.
That's crazy, because the cinematography holds up amazingly. I would have never even considered that it was shot that long ago.
Oh, yeah. I had the reason why I think the cinematography holds up. God, there's so much to say here. I had 5 red cameras at Rikers, 5 camera operators who were all hugely professional, had so much experience, were basically had done feature films and commercials, and were so excited about the project and passionate about it, they did it for free. So I was able to pull together a crew of pro bono talented folks. I had a DP, Fortunata Procopio, who was magnificent. It was really wonderful. Um, and so the work sat there for a long time.
So for a moment, let's go back 10 years, if we're able to, when the filmmaking process started. How did the process of collaborating with John Leguizamo in creating this film begin?
It's also a personal story for me, and you might have heard me say that that night. Somebody that what was the inspiration? Somebody I love very much in this world was sentenced to prison for a nonviolent offense, and it was the harsh trajectory of his life and mine that forced me to realize the lack of dignity and inhumanity in that world. And incarceration was a very, and still remains to be a very difficult thing in his life. So it's sad, but many people coming out of prison, they encounter a vicious cycle, not the opportunities of real freedom. If they lack education and they can't get a job, and they're likely to repeat the patterns of their past and reoffend. Uh, the statistics are scary. Something like 80% of people who get out of prison um, return within 3 years. John and I are supporters of an organization called Getting Out and Staying Out. It's an anti-recidivist organization in Harlem.
At that
Started.
time, do you know John beforehand, or is that where you meet him?
No, no, I met. You want to hear that story? I met
Kind of,
John at
yeah.
a
No, I
park,
do.
kind of, or
No,
no?
no, I
Like,
definitely do. I'm just being
I
coy.
okay. No, I met him at a party actually that was being put on by the founder of Getting Out and Staying Out, Mark Goldsmith, fabulous man. He has a story of his own and how he got to start this program. And we were talking. We were introduced, and we both had spent time in Hollywood. And I asked him if he had gone to Rikers yet to perform, and he said, "Yeah." He said, "I went there." I said, "So, are you interested in going back?" And he said, "Yeah, I really would be." I said, "Okay." So we fisted and said, "Let's try to make this happen, and so that we can support the organization and its direction." And I then went about attending meetings at the DOC, New York City Department of Corrections, and for 4 months, constant meetings, trying to convince them that they should allow us to come in and allow John to bring a little bit of laughter to a place in which laughter is not often heard, and for us to interview some of the justice involved young men that were involved in getting out and staying out already. They were already in the program. So finally, they agreed. And that's when I went to work pre production and pulled this all together. And we marched into Rikers, and we were there for 3 days.
As you're planning this with John, I mean, what strikes me about the film, and I think we talked about this a bit before, but
Mhm.
as a viewer who doesn't know what to expect, I see John Leguizamo in the title, and it says Live at Rikers, and I'm thinking, okay, is this going to be a concert film, featuring John Leguizamo, which
Mhm.
would be valid in its own right, but you start watching and you start to realize that in a way that kind of just feels like the hook. We see John performing his play Ghetto Clown, but the footage of him performing is cross-cut with scenes of him speaking with inmates and, young men who are incarcerated. When you start planning this film, did you already have in mind that this film would explore larger topics than just the topics that John explores in his play, but rather, I guess, a larger exploration of the criminal justice system and what happens to these young men that we often don't really hear about?
Uh, where do I begin with that? I knew that this was going to be the map of this film. I knew that we would go back and forth. What I didn't know is that I was going to end up with 20 hours worth of material and try to break it down to a 26-minute short documentary. Not easy. You've heard that adage, if I had more time, I'd write you a shorter letter.
Right.
Right? Well, that's what this experience was. I had my producer, Ben Konigsberg, brilliant filmmaker, really helped with that process, as did our editors and co-director. And we went at it. We knew that we wanted to not we wanted the film to speak for itself. We didn't want to get into the politics. Okay, this is more at Getting Out and Staying Out. They have, and it's in the film. You've seen it. They promote the three E's, which are education, um, employment, and emotional support, as being the magic formula for keeping these guys from returning to this prison life. And our film, I knew from the very beginning, partially I would say because of my personal experience, I wanted this to really focus on the emotional um, context of the subject and not so much the political. I didn't want to talk about victims. I didn't want to know what these guys did. I never knew what they did. I didn't want their last names to be shared because they're going forward with they were not sentenced yet. They had not even gone to court, so they were waiting. They were in the George Motion facility, which, like that one young man said, I've been here for 3 years, and they're not going to institutionalize me. They may lock me up, but they're not going to institutionalize me. I wanted people to have a visceral experience of what it was like for these guys to not hide behind their truth, as John encourages them to do, with his own autobiographical material and his own issues and demons, shared with them in the play. I wanted them to just be themselves and and John and I wanted most of all for them to have the experience of being treated with dignity, because that doesn't happen in prison. You're not treated with dignity. And with dignity, we knew that if they had an opportunity to talk about what was most important to them, that there was richness in that experience for them personally, but also for the audience. We wanted the audience to feel what it was like to have the challenge of being imprisoned, despite the fact of what they did. That's the human part of it. That was the humanity part of it. So that was really the focus, and in a way, that focus made our job easier. I've made a lot of short films in my life. I've made about 26 of those films, and I think I've thought a lot about how short films are like short stories. Comparing the two it's a very interesting exercise. And with short stories, I think you need to really know from the get-go what you want to say, and you don't want to say very much. You want to let the subject speak for the theme. It was my hope for this film that we accomplished that. John shared very intimate aspects of his life and his challenges in life. The fact that he was arrested. He shared his demons, and at the same time, he said, "You guys don't hide behind the truth. The sooner you get to that, the sooner your life will change, and you will have a different perspective." And that's what we wanted for the people who see this film, for them to kind of capture a glimpse of another perspective, to realize that the feelings of people who have served or who are serving time in prison, aren't much different than our own. Because I think society as a whole says, I'm not a criminal, so why should I care?
It's interesting you mentioned this idea of a short film as a short story, because I'm watching this piece that feels very successful and self-contained as a short, and there's, an extreme emotional weight to it, and it feels impactful. But you also mentioned that you had 20 hours of footage, and I'm wondering if you ever thought about making this a longer form film, and what convinced you that this film should be a shorter duration, or if you're already convinced, then that never changed.
I'm convinced now. I'm really glad that it's a shorter film. I'm not saying it would have been easier. It did start off, the rough cut was an hour. My producer, Ben Konigsberg, he said, just make this about this experience. Let's keep it that. And we'll have John's performance, which was amazing. And he was very nervous about going to Rikers, by the way. It was like he wasn't sure how his material would be received. And he did brilliantly. He put so much into it, so much of himself, did a beautiful job of performing. And it was only 45 minutes worth of material of the original Broadway play, Ghetto Clown, and the documentary, which was on, I think it was on HBO Max or Netflix, I can't remember, for years. And it's still relevant.
When you're filming in that space, when you're filming Rikers and you're filming these scenes with John and the inmates, and they have very intimate discussions about where they've been and where they hope to be, how do you create a space when you have limited time that feels safe and intimate? And I guess I was just struck by how open they were and how open John was in this environment that oftentimes does not support open dialogue or conversation.
I, let's see, start from the beginning. When we were there, I prepared my crew. There were a lot of rules and regulations that were kind of dire. We had to be really careful, and security and the whole thing, and behavior and all of that. And I very quickly realized how restrictive this was going to be. I couldn't go to the bath. I was one of two women. Abigail Fuller was the other woman on the crew, and we couldn't go to the bathroom without five guards. So I very quickly realized that they were worried about us, and that I realized that was going to be a challenge. To your point, that was going to be a challenge because I didn't want these guys to feel uncomfortable. They already had established a relationship with the social workers at Getting Out and Staying Out, and the psychologists at the prison. So they were prepared, and they volunteered. They really wanted to do this. They were excited to meet John, and especially after they saw the show and they realized he had been one of them, and there was so much that they could relate to. But we placed a couple of aisles worth of our subjects in the auditorium first, right after we shot the play and the exit of the prisoners and all of that. And several officers came up to me and said, no matter what you do, don't touch them. Don't really get into a conversation with these guys. Like they had a disease, don't do this, don't do that. And there were good security reasons for that. I understood. But I remember thinking to myself, if I don't establish a relationship that's personal with them and that touches them in some way, they are not going to open up. And John was on the same plate. He knew that as well too. He knew he needed to just be with them, be with them. So I promptly said, okay, and turned around and walked over to these guys, and one by one took their hands, not just a shake, but this, and thanked them, asked them their name, and thanked them for coming, went all the way down the line. And I did that with the guys that were in the classroom as well. So we had two scenes, two different places, environments that we did our interviews with. And I interacted with them, as did John and everybody else. It was just kind of like, oh, here we are. We're like making a film. And, everybody on both sides of the experience, we were all moved. Like, I'll tell you a cute anecdote. At the end, some of the prisoners were working in the garden and growing flowers. And they took these Coca-Cola cans and they cut them off and filled them with water. And they cut some of the flowers, put them in the Coke can, gave them to me, one to me, and I think one to Abigail. Anyway, so we're out, everything's done. We're outside. I'm sitting on a wall with John and we're kind of processing. And I look over and he has I don't have mine, but he's got one of the cans with the flowers in it. And I said, wait a minute, those are my flowers. And he goes, no, they're not. They're mine. He wanted to have, something physical from this experience that was so touching.
You mentioned that, you had personal experiences with someone who was incarcerated. And I'm wondering, is it challenging Or do you feel the need to even compartmentalize when you're making a film about this topic and your job is to record this and carve this story that, affects people while also dealing with your own personal understanding of this?
Nobody knew what I was going through. I made a point of not telling anyone. I told John later, many years later. I didn't even really think about it so much. I just wanted to do it. I wanted to know what that environment was like because I couldn't be there for the person um, uh, that was experiencing that, who was there, who was in prison at the time. And I needed to understand what it was like. I needed that I could be in a prison environment and be experiencing it myself on this level for the reasons why I was doing it. But I just kind of did it. I didn't really think until later when I looked at the footage. And that was the blessing of having that drive sit in my closet here in my office for so long until, Ben walked in and said, can I take a look at it? And it probably gave me that space to be able to do the post and to actually follow through because John really wanted us to make this film. And I had just moved to California. I just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. So when we got to the post production, I was able to emotionally both feel it at the same time and remove myself from the experience.
Do you feel like there was a specific reason why it took? I mean, I don't know how many years it took to start editing, but you said 10 years in full because you and John clearly went in with an intent, and then
Mhm.
it's sitting on a hard drive, this footage.
Why did it take so long? Well, like I said, I moved, money, raising enough money to be able to do post, which was not inexpensive, and maybe a little bit of fear about accomplishing that. It had been a while since I had made a film. I lived abroad. That was before we did this film, but there were periods of my life in which I wasn't focused on making film. I was writing. I've never stopped writing and developing concepts, and I have several right now um, that I would love to. Now that I've had this fabulous experience of getting this film done and having, people respond to it the way they're responding, I'm ready to keep going. It's jump starting. I think a lot of filmmakers go through these periods where life takes over. You're either, and for a woman, I call it the years of silence. I was raising young men, young boys, in a foreign environment. I lived in Europe for many years, and so it wasn't so much that I wasn't inspired. It's just that I hadn't jump started again. And I needed that. I needed partnership. I needed people that wanted to do this with me. Because I think filmmaking, to me, anything like that it's so much about community. It's so much about collaboration, which I love. I love working off of people and with people and arguing with people and making the right choices and putting yourself in a place where instinctually you get in touch with your instincts about what is going to work or not work. And then to have that final recognition when it does work that, yeah, you still got it. You can hone in on what it takes to make something, that matters. I think people think that film is just kind of instantaneous.
Right.
It's not.
I feel like especially now where everyone is just popping content out on various streaming
Oh,
platforms, everyone just assume it's like born and appears out of dust and is there in 10 seconds.
exactly. Exactly. And I think the upside of the pandemic, I mean, I did everything remote. I'd never done a film remotely. I'd always been at my mixes, everything. I was always hands on. This is remote for the most part. There's this little computer that I have here. So, and people are making beautiful films with cell phones, um, the work that came out of the pandemic, I mean, I looked at the work that was at Tribeca and other film festivals I'm attending, and I'm blown away. And these festivals are saying that we're getting more submissions than we've ever gotten before because we had the time to contemplate, to think about getting things done. So I don't think it's a, I know that I blew your mind about the fact that I shot this film so many years ago, but, you know, if it works, it works, right?
Exactly. And clearly it did. So did you make the call to John one day and you're like, "Oh, by the way, we're working on this film." How does that go down after such a long recess?
I sent him the rough cut. I surprised him. He was doing a Netflix series in London, and I get a phone call because we had talked over the years. Like, I think he gave up on me. Basically, is what had happened. And I sent him the rough cut, and he called me, and he had his wife look at it as well too, and he said, "We're in tears watching this. This is just brilliant. We are so blown away. Thank you so much. This is so great." And then, he helped me find my composer, Chris Hajian, who is beyond, just an amazingly talented person.
Beautiful work, yeah.
Oh yeah, and he was a joy to work with. God, he was just really a very talented guy. Anyway, so he called Chris and said, "I can share this story with you." I think he said, "Well, Chris, I told you one of these days," and they'd done projects together, a lot of them. He said, "One of these days I was going to bring you a project that was going to bring you a lot of money." He said, "But this is not one of those days." so,
Not
so
today.
not today. So, there's out of the graciousness of a lot of people, this film came to be. So John's been very, I mean, blown away, actually, very happy and very supportive and responsive. And he's getting a lot of recognition for the film. It's interesting. He didn't want that at first. He didn't want this to be about him. He wanted the film to be about the guys. And I think it's both. I think it works on both levels.
Going into that, you mentioned that you had this wonderful premiere at Tribeca with the film. Did you have specific goals after completing the film of what you wanted out of it, what it was going to do, or how it was going to impact people, or the visibility of it?
The visibility of it, I'll start with that now. To begin with, yeah, I really would love for this to be distributed through a mainstreamer, if at all possible. We're in the process of trying to do that. We're in the process of trying to sell the film. I think, just judged by the reaction of the audiences we've been around, I think people really want to see it. And of course, he's very popular now. He's doing he's always done amazing work forever and ever. Somebody told me he's been in over 100 films, and he's now very involved in Latino programming in his new company that he's merged with. So it's very exciting times for him. And so we're hoping that we can get this film out to people. The purpose of the film, what I could hope for, my dream, is that, again, people will look at this with a different perspective so that we don't have to see this recycling of prison and reform. The prison institutions in this country need a lot of attention, need a lot of work, and there's so much disparity between them, between the states, between cities and the states, in terms of sentencing and everything else in the criminal justice system. So it's about criminal justice reform, and I'm hoping that people will have a more empathetic experience. And I'm hoping also that their perspective will inspire them to look into the subject going forward. That when it comes up in their purview, that they will pay more attention to it and they will think about having seen this film and seeing these guys laugh, sad, hopeful, heroes of their own stories, that they will come to understand that things need to be done differently going forward. That's what John and I wanted from the very beginning. We wanted to highlight programs like Getting Out and Staying Out and what they're trying to do, anti-recidivist programs, and at the same time, give these guys the experience of laughter and dignity. We lose a lot of people in the system. That's it in a nutshell.
Elena, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
From the New York City Center for Media Education, this has been CME Presents. Available wherever you get your podcasts. Music is by Jacob Backer, William Hutchison, and Sean Sparacino. If you like what you hear, please rate, subscribe, and review. And don't forget to check out our website at nyccenterformediaeducation.org for more information about media making and filmmaking classes.